Hi everyone, this is week 11, video 2, and we've just outlined G.E. Moore's responses to skepticism, his proof of an external world, and his defense of common sense, very, very briefly. There's much more you can say on that, but we've done it briefly, just to give us the required background in order to look at Wittgenstein's own objections and his own response to skepticism. So, as part of Moore's proof of an external world is the premise, I know I've got hands, uttered by Moore. And it's that premise that Wittgenstein thinks is suspect. It's not because he thinks that Moore's assuming exactly what it needs to prove, which is the kind of charge of circularity which other philosophers have levelled against Moore. That's not Wittgenstein's worry. He thinks there's something else wrong with this premise. He says, this is the very first remark of uncertainty, he says, if you do know that here is one hand, we'll grant you all the rest. And that's him talking directly to Moore, saying, yeah, the argument works. Of course it works if we grant you the premise. But he has a problem with that premise, and it's not the problem that Moore's assuming what he's trying to prove. It's not that problem, it's a separate problem. And one of the first things that Wittgenstein notices is that it's a very strange sounding sentence. A very odd sounding sentence. I know I've got hands. You would never hear that sentence in ordinary life. That's why it's cropped up in a kind of philosophical context, and in fact the propositions that do crop up in philosophical context are precisely those ones that sound odd in everyday life. So he says it sounds odd. Why does it sound odd? Why does it sound odd? Well, for one thing, Wittgenstein says, is we have to look at what the word know means and how the word know is used ordinarily. And what Wittgenstein's pointing to is the fact that there is a game, a language game, which we might call the game of knowing. So what we're looking for are the rules that govern correct use of the word know. And what Wittgenstein says in remark 6, he says, now, can one enumerate what one knows, like Moore, straight off like that? I believe not. For otherwise, the expression I know gets misused, and through this misuse, a queer and extremely important mental state seems to be revealed. So, Wittgenstein is saying Moore's statement that I know I've got hands is odd because we don't in ordinary life just list the things we know. That doesn't seem to be a correct use of the word know. And in remark 9 he says, now do I, in the course of my life, make sure I know that here is a hand? And in remark 11 then he says, we just do not see how very specialised the use of I know is. What Wittgenstein is pointing to is the fact that the phrase I know is used in quite specific circumstances, and it's not used just to formulate lists, and it's not used completely out of context, and this issue of context will become extremely important as we get through this material. So Wittgenstein is saying, well, the premise sounds weird because it's been the phrase I know is being misused. It's not being used according to the rules governing the game of knowing. And what are these rules? Well, one of these rules is something like this. You can use the phrase I know only in such cases as you're in a position to give grounds justifying your knowledge. That's what Wittgenstein points to. He says, it's only legitimate to use the word I know if you are able to give some reasons as to why or how you know. So, for instance, if I say, look, I know that it's going to rain tomorrow. I really know that. And I'm being sincere, and I'm not joking, not trying to make a weird point. I just say I know. So we shouldn't go to the zoo because it's definitely going to be raining. And if you turn around and say to me, how do you know? You have got a right to expect some kind of answer, some sensible answer. And if you go, how do you know? And I say, I don't know. There's no such issue here. I've not found out through any reasons. I don't have any reasons to support my knowledge claim. Then you won't just say you don't know that. You'll start to think that I'm actually using the word know wrong. So it's not just that I'm false, that I'm making a false claim. A false claim would be my saying, I know it's going to rain tomorrow, and it not raining tomorrow, it being sunny. Now that would be a false claim. I wouldn't have known it, because you can only know things that are true. But if you'd have asked me for supporting reasons and I said I saw it on the weather report, then you'd still think, okay, fine, he understands what the word know means, but he's got it wrong on this occasion. He was actually wrong that he knew that it was going to rain tomorrow. But if you said, how do you know it's going to rain tomorrow? And I didn't tell you that I've looked at the weather report. I just couldn't give you any reason. I said, what do you mean? Why? I don't have to give you a reason. You'd say, no, you do have to give me a reason. You are obliged to be able to give reasons, because that's what the game of knowing involves. The phrase I know is specifically used in situations, or correctly used in situations, when the person using it can give grounds or is in a position to give grounds. And if we think about More's premise, that I know I've got hands, Wittgenstein wants us to come to see that it's wrong to say I know I've got hands, because you can't give any grounds. You can't give any grounds or supporting reasons there. Why? Well, firstly, More agrees that you can't give any supporting grounds, because he says he's more certain of that proposition than he is of any other. So More agrees that you can't give supporting grounds, and Wittgenstein's saying, well, in that case, More, you're ignoring the way that I know is used. You're ignoring a proper close inspection of that language game. And Wittgenstein thinks that we can't give grounds for the claim, I know I've got hands, because the claim, I've got hands, is a proposition describing our world picture. Remember, this is what we looked at last week. I have hands is a kind of paradigmatic example of a proposition describing our world picture, because it is a foundation. It is the riverbed, as Wittgenstein says, or the fixed point against which everything else rotates. So Wittgenstein says, well, you can't give any justifying grounds. You're not in a position to give any grounds, because your proposition that you know you have hands is a proposition describing your world picture, and it's of the very nature of propositions describing your world picture that they are the bedrock. They're the end point, and you can't give any further grounds for them. So Wittgenstein says your use of the phrase I know I've got hands is wrong. That's why it sounds wrong. It sounds wrong because it is wrong. It's a bizarre phrase. It's a phrase that you'd never hear outside of a philosophical context. You're flouting the rules which govern the use of I know. You're flouting those rules. Consequently, your premise, More, this is Wittgenstein's view, is a kind of nonsense. It doesn't really make sense. If someone ever said that to you, you wouldn't understand what they were aiming at, or you'd think that they didn't know what hands were, or that they didn't know what the word no means, or that they were trying to learn what certain words mean. You'd think something had gone wrong. Now, Wittgenstein thinks also that you'd think that something has gone wrong if someone tells you just straight off, in Wittgenstein's phrase, straight off, i.e. with no context. You'd think someone was being a bit strange if they just came out of the blue and said, I know I've got hands. And what that tells you is another feature of the game of knowing. So we've just seen that one aspect of knowing is you're being in a position to give reasons. You can only correctly use the phrase I know if you are in a position to give supporting reasons. Well, another rule governing the use of I know is that you're only correctly using the phrase I know in a situation in which your sentence is relevant to something, or where there is some context by which we can judge whether or not that sentence is useful. So the phrase I know is never used totally and utterly out of the blue. It's always used for a reason. So, for instance, in my example earlier, I'm saying I know it's going to rain tomorrow because we're talking about going to the zoo and it's relevant, and there's a point to saying it. If someone just says to you completely out of all context, oh, I know that my eyes are pointing forwards instead of into the back of my own head, that's just going to come off really weird. Or even if they say out of the blue something a bit more mundane, like, you've just been sat on a train with someone, they just look up at you and go, I know that London is the capital of the UK. Something's gone wrong there, and what's gone wrong is that you are not operating, or the person making the claim is not operating within a context. So sentences only make sense, or claims to know things only make sense in context. Wittgenstein elaborates in paragraph 350. He says, in quotes, I know that that's a tree, is something a philosopher might say to demonstrate to himself or to someone else that he knows something. Similarly, someone who was entertaining the idea that he was no use anymore might keep repeating to himself, I can still do this and this and this. If such thoughts often possessed him, one would not be surprised if he, apparently out of all context, spoke such a sentence out loud. And then in brackets he says, which is really, really important for us, he says, but here I have already sketched a background, a surrounding for this remark, that is to say, given it a context. And after that he says, but if someone in quite heterogeneous circumstances called out with the most convincing mimicry, down with him, one might say of these words and their tone that they were a pattern that does indeed have a familiar application. But in this case, it was not even clear what language the man in question was speaking. I might make with my hand the movement I should make if I were holding a handsaw and sawing through a plank. But would one have any right to call this movement sawing out of all context? So there Wittgenstein is emphasising and impressing upon us the need for a context in order that certain sentences, such as I know, even make sense. I mean, actually Wittgenstein says that if someone completely out of the blue, with no warning, just said down with him, for a second you might not even know what language they were speaking. It would take you some time to cotton on. You'd have to decode what was going on. You'd have to separate the words. and then realised that they were identical with English words. And that just goes to show how odd sounding things are when they're completely out of context. And so Wittgenstein has said, well, someone might say, I can still do this and this and this. And we might explain how that sentence has a meaning, but we can only do that by giving a background, by giving a context. So Wittgenstein himself has given a context. He says, well, this person's saying this because he's reminding himself that he's, still useful. And what's important there is Wittgenstein saying you've got to provide a context, otherwise it just doesn't make any sense. It's just odd. And similarly with, I know that that's a tree. A philosopher might say this for such and such reasons, We've had to give a context there in order to make sense of it. But if you just come out and say, I know that that's a tree, well, it's really not clear what the sentence is doing. And remember, right back to the beginning of the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein thinks of language use as analogous to using a tool. And the emphasis is on use. So idle claims like, I know that I've got hands, out of all context, don't make any sense. So that's something else wrong with More's view, is he's assuming that the sentence, I know I've got hands, is meaningful just all on its own. That you can defend that sentence on its own against skeptical opponents. And Wittgenstein's saying, well, I'm not sure that that's really a correct use of the phrase, I know. You're not paying attention more to the fact that sentences involving knowledge claims have got to be uttered in a context. They've got to have a identifiable use. You've got to be able to give a background understanding of them. And you've got to be able to give grounds. You can't give any grounds because it's exactly that kind of proposition that describes our world picture, which is the ground of all other discourse. So you can't provide any further grounds. And the sentence is just coming out of the blue, and it can't really be, no sense can be made of it out of the blue. It can't stand on its own out of a conversation and be asked questions of. So More is unsuccessful. I mean, we saw last week that the skeptic is unsuccessful if they're trying to doubt everything, because they can't doubt their world picture propositions, or it will be unclear whether they're making sense anymore. So that's one thing. That's what Wittgenstein said. Last week he said, well, you can't doubt everything. That doesn't make sense. Look back at last week if you want a refresher on that. And now this week he's saying, well, you can't just say that you know everything either. That doesn't make sense. In the former case, the skeptic wasn't looking at the correct use of the word doubt, and in this case, More isn't looking at the correct use of the word know. He's not paying attention to the complexity involved in the game of knowing. And consequently, that's why his premise sounds bizarre, because it is bizarre. So Wittgenstein says, well, both the skeptic and More are doing something wrong. So More's argument fails, his defence fails, because his premise, I know I have hands, is deeply problematic, as it is. But Wittgenstein does think that there is a good response to skepticism, and actually it's the final remark that he ever wrote down, just 2 days, before he died. It's the final one, and it's a really, really clever remark. He says, but even in such cases, I can't be mistaken. Isn't it possible, but even if in such cases I can't be mistaken, isn't it possible that I am drugged? If I am, and if the drug has taken away my consciousness, then I am not now really talking and thinking. I cannot seriously suppose that I am at this moment dreaming. Someone who, dreaming, says, I am dreaming, even if he speaks audibly in doing so, is no more right than if he said in his dream, "It is raining," while it was in fact raining, even if his dream were actually connected with the noise of rain. What is Wittgenstein saying? So first things first, if you were dreaming that while it was raining outside, and let's say this noise of rain came into your awareness somehow, and then you said out loud while sleeping, but you did say out loud, you said, "It's raining." Wittgenstein says that wouldn't make any sense, because that sentence, that utterance, is being completely torn out of any context of use. It's not a useful sentence. There's no background to it. There's no context accompanying it where we can understand what it means. And if someone said that, you wouldn't take them as expressing information. You'd just go, okay, they're asleep. They're just sleep talking. And the sentence wouldn't really make any sense. Now, if you said, while you're dreaming, that you're dreaming, let's say out loud, that doesn't make any sense either. Wittgenstein says, "I cannot seriously suppose that I am at this moment dreaming." And that's one example of sort of skepticism. It's one version of external world skepticism, that everything's a dream. Wittgenstein says, well, there's another case of skepticism. Let's say I'm not dreaming. Let's say I've been drugged. Isn't it possible that I am drugged? This is the kind of skeptical challenge. Well, how do you know you've got hands? You might be drugged. Well, Wittgenstein says, if I am, and if the drug has taken away my consciousness, then I am not now really talking. So, if it's true that you've been drugged and that everything you see is an illusion, and that your hands are figments of your imagination, then it's also true that you are not capable of talking. Because to talk, to communicate with other people, requires the existence of rules governing language use, the possibility of communication, of talking to people, requires that there be a society which has a culture of language use. And remember, these are the things that we've been looking at over the past few weeks. Language, Wittgenstein says, can't be purely private. Language use is a cultural practice or a custom which we engage in. And so, if skepticism is true and you're the only person that exists, then the sentence, "I'm the only person that exists," doesn't make sense. Because it isn't part of a cultural practice or a custom. There's no rules governing its use. Because by hypothesis, no one else exists. So if solipsism is true, if it's true that you're the only person that exists, then that claim cannot be sensibly made. So Wittgenstein's response, really, to skepticism is to say that it's nonsense. If it's true, it can't be made. The claim can't be made. If it's true that you're just dreaming everything, then your words don't have any meaning because they're not part of a regulated social, cultural practice. You're just dreaming that you're making a claim, but you're not really making a claim. And it's quite clever. It might make you feel a little bit shortchanged. You might say, okay, but you'd still be dreaming, or something like that. And I expect that's what people will say, but we'll discuss that in the in-person sessions in greater detail. For now, all I want you to do is to see Wittgenstein's point, is that if it's true that you've been drugged and everything is a figment of your imagination, then you can't sensibly state that everything is a figment of your imagination. Because to make sensible claims requires the existence of cultural practices, rule-governed applications of words. And if everything's a figment of your imagination, those things aren't there. So you can't be making sense. So skepticism, if true, is nonsense, or something like that. And that's Wittgenstein's response. So it's not a straightforward response in the sense that More is saying, my knowledge that I've got hands, on balance, beats your knowledge that I could be dreaming. Wittgenstein's point is that both of these claims are nonsense. But if it's nonsense to be a skeptic or to make skeptical claims, if true, then we don't need to worry about it, because you just can't raise the problem. If it's made sense, if someone has made sense when they've uttered a skeptical claim, the claim thereby must be false. Because if it was true, it would be nonsense. Because there wouldn't be all these culturally embedded practices and rules governing language use, public, not private rules that are required in order for claims to be sensible. So that's Wittgenstein's response, and I think that's all. I think we'll leave it there for now. But I'm sure that people will have opinions on this, whether it's successful, whether it's not successful. And you may well be completely baffled by it, in which case we'll clarify it at length in the in-person sessions. So yeah, just to sum up, More has arguments against skepticism. His proof of an external world relies on the premise that he knows he has hands. Wittgenstein says that the utterance of that premise is odd-sounding because it disobeys the rules governing the use of the phrase "I know." But then he points out that skepticism, if true, isn't capable of being sensibly asserted. And so if it makes sense at all, it's got to be false. So Wittgenstein has his own kind of, it's less a solution to skepticism than a kind of dissolution of the problem. He's saying that skepticism is not something that we need to be worried about. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks everyone, and see you next time.